Our next presentation is a keynote from Lisa Messeri. Lisa's work is central to contemporary discussions of the planetary. In her case, it's specifically interested in exoplanetary, that is, planets that exist outside of our solar system. Lisa comes to these as an anthropologist, and so she's questioning how the expanded reorientation of our sense of place is demanded by the decentering of Earth as typical or ideal or indeed essential. The discovery of exoplanets, all of which have been identified since the fall of the Berlin Wall, are constructed not by direct visceral observation, but by secondary, tertiary, inferential data, bits of knowledge that are only possible through a technical alienation of our senses. And yet they serve not only to make place, but indeed to remake what place is. If, for example, for Sun Ra, space was in fact a place where society, culture, systems are reimagined to give power to the oppressed, then its status as an outside is, to a certain extent, always in question. Outside of what? Space as escape, or space as pure space, Cartesian, Euclidean, astronomic, so forth, gives way to space as place, not the absence of place. Now, today, now that Earthlings, Earth has sent out various animals and probes and detected exoplanets, those sites and surfaces, those other astronomic bodies, inform the potential of a kind of comparative anthropology of place, one that, having been discovered, is now, in a way, finally possible for the first time. And as said, because space is place, its outsideness, and because its outsideness is always relational, what Frank White called the overview effect, by which of this sort of seeing of the whole, is always, at least potentially, within another overview, an overview of the overview. And this infinite regress, one inside the other, both real and potential, this is the home, in essence, to which we must always return, no matter how far we venture. And for that, if to the extent that Earth remains a referent, its Copernican decentering is always available to this comparative, even if the comparative is constructed. So with that, Lisa Messeri is an assistant professor of sociocultural anthropology at Yale. Her book, Placing Outer Space, which Duke published in 2016, is the one from which my remarks above are largely drawn. Her current work is on virtual reality. And with that, I introduce Lisa Messeri.
All right. Hi, I want to just begin with a congratulations to the students. This has been a trying several months for all of us, and to have gotten to the final presentations despite a pandemic is really amazing. So congratulations to the students, and also thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm Lisa Messeri, and I'm an anthropologist at Yale, and I'm going to talk today about a concept that I call the planetary imagination. So I'm an anthropologist of science, and what that means is that I spend time kind of working and hanging out with scientists and understanding the kind of human meaning that gets imparted to the work that they do. And I'm talking today about research that I conducted amongst planetary scientists that began around 2008 and that I conducted for about a decade, both researching alongside scientists, but then spending quite a lot of time reading their work and writing about the practices that I observed during my research. I began writing a book in the early 2010s about planetary scientists. And interestingly, this was right at the moment when the Anthropocene conversation really took hold within academic circles and humanistic circles. And whereas I had been writing about the planetary and thinking about it as a concept that was really exclusive to the cosmos, suddenly there were a whole lot of other scholars in different fields that were also talking about the planetary. And of course, some of this predates the 2010s. For example, earlier in the 2000s, Gayatri Spivak was already writing about planetarity as a way of thinking about this shift that she observed from an idea of thinking about human-planet relations from global agents to planetary subjects. And of course, Deepesh Chakrabarty writes in his Climate of History essay about the planetary crisis as a way of understanding climate change. And anthropologist Joe Masco also asked, what does it even mean to imagine a planetary crisis? So there were all these conversations that were happening about the planetary in critical scholarship. And suddenly, studies of outer space became germane to social theory. So I think it's really interesting that the Strelka Institute selected the terraforming as its current theme, because this reflects a playful intellectual interplanetary exchange that was kind of beginning during my research and really culminating now. What if, for example, with the terraforming, one is to take a concept from outer space, the idea of terraforming Mars to make it more habitable for kind of potential future humans. And what if you apply that same rationality to thinking about what would, in fact, make Earth more habitable? So the idea of the planetary allows us to think across different scales in the solar system and the universe. But I worry a little bit about what's happening in the discourse of the planetary. One thing I worry about is what might get lost when outer space becomes a resource of metaphor and imagery, rather than focusing on the concrete, physical, and epistemological reality of studying and thinking about the cosmos. And I also worry, and this is a bit more acute, that the planet and planetary is starting, particularly in critical theory, to become synonymous with Earth. And what might we lose when the capaciousness of the term the planetary becomes exclusively associated with one planet? So the challenge that I'm going to pose is to ask about how the planetary can continue to aid in our blurring of categories between life and non-life, human and non-human, and also how a planetary can help us with the project of decentering not only the human, but also Earth. So as I go through this talk, the first thing I'm going to do is define what I mean by the planetary imagination. Then I'm going to give an example of, very briefly, how planetary imaginations of Earth on the one hand and exoplanets, which are planets in orbit around other stars, on the other hand, kind of unfold and emerge. And then finally, I'm going to return back to recent invocations of the planetary by both scientists and social scientists, and really think about what these different rhetorics of the planetary can teach us, so that we can really push what this concept can do for us. So let me begin with the planetary imagination. This is a concept that came out of my ethnographic research, and it emerged from thinking ethnographically about what the planetary meant to the scientists I was working with. So let me just read this brief passage from my book titled Placing Outer Space. The planetary imagination indexes the holistic conceptions that scientists have of the planets they study. The planetary imagination includes scientific understandings of the planet and conceptions of planetary pasts and futures, as well as notions of what it would be like to live on other planets. The planetary imagination is yet another way of talking about the placehood of planets. So the planetary, I initially argued, was made meaningful because it allowed place to scale up beyond the local and offered a different way of intimately connecting with geographies beyond the human. Place had been this really important concept for me in my research because I wanted to understand how human meaning extends into the cosmos, how people can become to really feel attached to and indeed understand and deeply know these planets that are so distant. But place also helps us understand the possibility and problems of thinking about Earth as a planetary place. It really challenges us to understand the limits of what the planetary can do for us in terms of the scale at which we can think Earth as planetary. And so while my initial definition of the planetary imagination really emerged from studying the practices of planetary scientists and the research that they were doing concerning planets other than Earth, my more recent thinking on the concept of the planetary is much more placing the planetary in relation. So really thinking about Earth and other planets all as part of this thing we call the planetary. So whereas the definition here of the planetary imagination really applies to planets that aren't the Earth, I want us to begin really stitching these different ideas together. So in order to do that, let's take a look at how a planetary imagination forms. And first, I'm going to kind of show a very glossed way at which it has evolved for Earth and then for exoplanets. So I'm certainly not the first to observe the ways in which our imagination of Earth kind of began in this kind of local and placed understanding of the planet and kind of became global as our thinking evolved. And of course, this happens in an ahistorical way. So humans thought about the global and imagined the Earth as global much before we could actually see Earth as global. And Dennis Cosgrove's Apollo's Eye really beautifully marks out these kinds of imaginaries in the Western canon. But let's just imagine kind of the emplaced experience that humans first had of Earth that eventually evolved into this global thinking, which of course is made literal with the Apollo missions. But then something really interesting happens much more recently to the planetary imagination of Earth. And that is in the post-space race, in an age in which we have taken so much data about Earth, we now are able to not only think about it as a landscape or as a globe, but also as an abstraction. And so this is an image from a scientific paper written by exoplanet astronomers, which were trying to kind of do a thought experiment. If we collected the kind of data that we have for exoplanets, which is very low resolution, from scant data, would we be able to really know if we were looking at a planet as interesting, as geologically diverse as Earth? So what this team did was they took a bunch of satellite imagery of Earth. They reduced it, so they basically pixelated it, so it was the same resolution as exoplanet data. And then they looked at that reduced and even blurred data and said, can we extract from this quote unquote alien map that this is an interesting planet? And so the alien map is on the bottom of this image. And what they argue is yes, even if we have very low resolution data, we can still detect an interesting planet, a planet like Earth. So this culmination of kind of the planetary imagination of Earth is one that today allows for abstraction. Now, what I find really interesting about this is kind of the reverse of how the exoplanetary imagination has evolved. So for exoplanets, which are planets around an orbit of stars other than our sun, they are so dim and faint compared to their host star that they are, for all intents and purposes, invisible to spectators from Earth, even to our most powerful space-based telescopes. So for exoplanet astronomy, the planetary imagination necessarily begins as an abstraction. It begins as data that suggests that there might be a planet in orbit around a star. But then through the careful work and communication between scientists and artists, we begin to have actually some of a sense of what the exoplanet might look like as a globe. And then much more recently, in terms of the 30 or so year of exoplanet astronomy, we're even beginning to have artistic representations of what it might look like or feel like or be like to stand on the surface of an exoplanet. So what I'm trying to show is that these are kind of two different directions by which the planetary and the planetary imagination might emerge. And in both cases, what we see is how the planetary is enmeshed between local specificity and abstraction. But we also see that there isn't an a priori direction by which the planetary imagination unfolds. And actually, I think that the experiment of the terraforming is a wonderful example of the payoff of being fluid with the directionality of the development of the planetary imagination, because it's not kind of presuming a move from habitability to inhabitability. It's kind of suggesting that kind of both of these processes might simultaneously be happening, or might both be proceeding at the same time. So as I said at the beginning of the talk, what I'm advocating for here in thinking about is to keep in mind that the planetary does not exclusively mean Earth, but that there is also a set of scientific practices that have created the concept of the planetary, and these can be instructive for the ways in which the planetary is used in our critical theory. So now that I've given an example of what I mean by the planetary imagination and some of these images and practices that go along with the work, I want to turn to first how the planetary has changed in recent years for the scientific practitioners that I worked with, but also how the planetary can continue to really push our critical thinking about the concept, how the scientific work can change the way we've been thinking about the planetary. All right, so recently I saw this publication from an exoplanet astronomer, Sarah Seeger, whom I worked with and write about in my book. The title of this article is Potential for Life in Hydrogen-Dominated Exoplanet Atmospheres. And the way in which life has become part of the exoplanetary discourse has really fascinated me. You might have noticed in the previous images of both Earth and exoplanets that well, particularly exoplanets, that the imaginations were primarily geological. And when I was doing my research, scientists were really careful to delineate the work that they were doing, which was a search for worlds, from the work of people looking for life beyond Earth. So a search for worlds as distinct for a search from life. And this was very particular political work in order to allow exoplanet astronomy to gain some distinction and not be confused with the search for little green men. Now exoplanet astronomy is very well regarded. It has a kind of a robust scientific lineage. And so what I find really interesting is that the idea of life is sneaking back in, that what used to be a planetary imagination dominated by kind of a geological imagination, now the biological imagination is very much at play. And in allowing kind of the biological back in, what astronomers are doing now is really stretching what life even means vis-a-vis its interplay with the planetary. So in this article, Seeger writes, in fact, pleads with her colleagues, quote, "We want to be ready to recognize signs of life on any of the few precious planets we will have available for observation," end quote. So again, what I find really interesting is the way in which the exoplanetary is no longer exclusively about place and geology, which was my initial categories of interest, but increasingly about potential liveliness. So that the planetary in the hands of exoplanet astronomers is now a site for experimenting with the codependency of geological makeup and conditions for life serves as a really interesting rough analogy for how the planetary for humanists has also become a fruitful concept for challenging divisions between life and non-life, human and non-human. And I think we see this analogy most forcefully in post-colonial studies, which has been a really significant field in terms of development of the planetary as a critical term. And this is because for post-colonial scholars, unlike the global, the planetary really kind of suggests an entwining between human and non-human. And this opens up different ways and new ways of thinking about interdependent futures. So as post-colonial scholar Achille Mbembe has said in an interview, there is an explicit kinship between plantation slavery, colonial predation, and contemporary forms of resource extraction and appropriation. In each of these instances, there is a constitutive denial of the fact that we, the humans, co-evolve with the biosphere. This is why, in its most historical sense, decolonization is by definition a planetary enterprise, a radical openness of and to the world, a deep breathing for the world as opposed to insulation. So Mbembe here uses the planetary to place the injustices inflicted on both humans and the land on the same interdependent scale. We see a similar move by Catherine Yusof in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, in which she argues that Anthropocene thinkers, who are necessarily planetary thinkers, have ignored the human suffering that attends the concept of the Anthropocene, failing to, quote, as she writes in the book, failing to redress the legacy of racialized subjects that geology leaves in its wake. So the planetary for scientists and humanists has come to stand for this inseparability of life and non-life, human and non-human, and indeed demands expanding our understanding of these interrelations. And yet, I think there's a missed opportunity if humanistic discourse reduces the planetary to being synonymous with Earth, as both Mbembe and Yusof and many others do. This curtails the kind of thinking that can be done alongside planetary scientists, both in recognizing the resonant activities of experimenting with the bounds of the geological and the biological, and also treating the planetary as not exclusively terrestrial, but rather this much more capacious category. So often when the planetary is invoked in service of decentering the human, it actually serves to recenter Earth. And we see this in Dipesh Chakrabarty's recent reflection on the planet, as he marvels how, in contrast to globe or world, planet does not centrally address the human. Rather, the planet is, he writes, something that is the condition of human existence, and yet profoundly indifferent to that existence. So even as Chakrabarty acknowledges that comparative planetology provided a conceptual basis for Earth system science, which is the interdiscipline that serves as the backbone of the Anthropocene, he leaves unexplored the implications of this more expansive and relational understanding of the planetary. The planetary matters for Chakrabarty insofar as it decenters the human, but he leaves the decentering of Earth as a scientific concern. So here I'm just going to pose some questions that I want us to think about going forward. What if we were to ask more of the planetary, no longer assuming it refers exclusively to Earth, but instead, what if the planetary indexes the limits of our knowledge, the unfathomable scale and set of cosmic connections that the human, astronomers included, have yet to fully comprehend? What if we were to untether the planetary from Earth, from the Anthropocene, from the human? Decentering the human is a powerful and challenging project, and the concept of the planetary can aid in this thinking by also decentering the Earth. The planetary, if it's allowed to index these infinite worlds in the universe, demands that we work against assumptions that limit our understanding of life and livelihood. An expansive meaning of the planetary acknowledges that we still struggle to know and discern the scale at which human actions matter across time and space. And with those questions to ponder on the planetary, I will end here. Thank you for listening.